Hey guys, I wanted to update you on some of the reading that we've done the last couple of days, just to make sure that you're right on track with where we're going and that you have an idea of where we're going next. And so we finished last week on the land of the Cyclops, and we realized how cunning Odysseus is when he provides Polyphemus with the name Nobody, because he realizes at that point that once Polyphemus leaves the cave and he says his name, he says, nobody has attacked me. He realizes at that moment that that's the moment to leave, and no other Cyclopses are going to come after him. And he also comes up with the idea of the sheep kind of leading them out to pasture, and that's how they're able to escape. So it wasn't a matter that he wanted to kill a Polyphemus. He needed Polyphemus to open up the cave, because the boulder was way too heavy for any of his men to open it. So he had to certainly use Polyphemus's strength. Okay. So that's where we're at. We're right here. And so we're going to make our way kind of up through, mostly up through, let's see here, the cattle of the sun gods is where we'll end here. So we're going to be kind of moving around a little bit. We'll probably end up right around here, number 13, for the end of the week. Okay, so after they leave the island at this point, Odysseus and his men stop at the island of Aelios. And he is the god of wind, and they give him a bag of powerful winds. And this bag was told not to be open, and of course the men think it's a bag of treasure. And so they open it up, and it sends them way beyond their course, of course, away from home. And Ithaca again is right here. So they're pretty close to Ithaca, but obviously they're kind of dumb, don't listen, don't pay attention. And Aelios sends them north, and they send them to the land of the cannibals. Of course, now the land of the cannibals, this is not a good place. Odysseus's men are now coming up on this suspicious island, number 6, and the crew that is on Odysseus' ship decide not to land there, boat into the harbor. This is kind of another clever moment of Odysseus. He does send a couple of men to see who and what is on the island, and the crew members see a woman, decide to go towards her. She offers them to visit their home, and they're met with the cannibals. And of course, unfortunately, those men were not able to get back onto the harbor. So they leave this area, and they decide to move a little bit north here as well into the land of Circe. Now, what you need to know about Circe is she has the power to turn humans into animals. So they meet Circe. She invites them in to join her in drinking wine. Now, this wine is super delicious, very good. But they decide at this point that, they've been gone long enough, and some of the men do decide to drink some of the wine. So they drink some of the wine, and unfortunately, that turns the men into pigs. Odysseus was trying to encourage his men not to do that, but unfortunately that happens. So after some of them are turned into pigs after drinking the wine, they actually move up here to the land of the dead, where they meet a blind prophet by the name of Tiresias. And Tiresias is blind, much like Homer. Homer, remember, he wrote the Odyssey, and he is a blind prophet. And so here, when he goes to the land of the dead, Odysseus basically talks to Tiresias. And he also finds out that Poseidon is really upset about how he treated Polyphemus. Now, remember, Polyphemus is Poseidon's son. And so this is going to make his journey even longer. So he is punished again, and he tells them that also he finds out that Odysseus finds out that his wife, Penelope, is also being pursued by a lot of suitors. Now, being the king of Ithaca, he's been gone probably by this time about 15 years. So that's a considerable amount of time. And so he knows that he needs to get home somehow. So Tiresias, being a prophet, he also warns him about what's going to happen in the future. So he talks to him about don't touch the cattle of the sun god, don't eat the cattle of the sun god. He also meets his mother down there. She tells him what's been happening in Ithaca, and he decides at that point that he's going to leave the land of the dead. And he actually ends up going back to Circe's once more. Okay, so there, Circe actually warns them about something else that's going to happen, and it's called the sirens. So they kind of make their way through this little area down here to the sirens. So we're kind of at the boot of Italy here. So Odysseus's men, they properly bury any of his crew members. They head to the land where the sirens are, and the sirens were sailors who sang so beautifully that it was kind of hypnotizing. The sirens wanted to lure Odysseus and his men into the island while they're sailing by. So he uses creative thinking to kind of make sure that his men are not injured, but he hears what the sirens do. And so what he does is he actually tells his men, tie him to the mast of the ship. And anytime he wants to get down from the mast of the ship, he says, tie me tighter. Now, in order for the men to avoid not hearing the sirens, he actually sticks beeswax in the men's ears so they can't hear what the sirens are doing. If you hear the siren's voice, it means you want to basically crash your boat. So he ties himself to the mast so they could not hear, and that is how they're able to avoid the sirens. Now, that's probably the easiest of the journey that's going to happen. So they go to, they kind of make their way down here, and they meet two, I wouldn't call them creatures, but they meet two beings, and they're basically Charybdis and Scylla. Now, this is important that Odysseus kind of has to think of the best way to do this here. He sees basically, hold on, I'm trying to get through my notes here, sorry. So once they get to Scylla and Charybdis, let me grab my folder here. Once they get there, Scylla is basically, sorry, there we are. So Scylla is a six-headed monster, and then Charybdis is a giant whirlpool. So once they go through that, they have to decide what is the best case here. Do you avoid 6 men dying, or do you go and have the whole ship die? So with the six-headed monster, they decide that he's going to go closer to Scylla rather than Charybdis. Okay, so that's pretty much what happens there. Scylla is less dangerous than Charybdis, and so while Odysseus and his crew were avoiding Charybdis, Scylla attacks the boat, kills 6 men, and captures them, and they decide to go on their way. It's a super short setting there, okay? So then they make their way down here to number 13, and this section here is called the Cattle of the Sun God, okay? At the Cattle of the Sun God, Odysseus warns his men not to touch the sun god's cattle. So we've already been told this, but so the storm rages for a month, and their food supply is exhausted at this point, and they're so hungry. So one of the shipmates convinces the others that eating the cattle is preferable rather than starving to death. And so Odysseus wakes up and he discovers that his men have feasted on the cattle. He curses the gods for letting him sleep during the feast, so they could not restrain his men. So that's another instance where, things just do not go Odysseus's way, either because he's foolish or because his men certainly don't want to listen to him. So starving is worse than dying at sea is what some of the men say. So Zeus lets the men feast one more day, and then he sends a terrible storm and destroys the ships again. So as Odysseus is kind of grabbing onto some driftwood, and because he hadn't eaten, the gods had favored him, and so he survives. Odysseus is not present to stop them, and they may be gossiping a little bit about the mortals, but Zeus seems to be the only level-headed god that doesn't sympathize, or that sympathizes with it. So Odysseus at this point is really the only one that survives. So we'll head to Calypso's island a little bit here. We'll talk a little bit more about heading to 15 and 16, but Odysseus is actually the only one that is able to make it back to Ithaca. And we'll discuss that a little bit more next week in the video. So just keep up with the vocab, keep up with some of the material, check Canvas, ask questions, send me messages on Remind, send me emails, whatever you need. I look forward to seeing some of your pictures this week on vocab, but good luck, and hopefully I'll see you soon.